When we think of the Middle Ages, we often conjure images of chaste knights, virginal maidens locked in towers, and stern clergy wagging their fingers at any hint of physical pleasure. The popular imagination paints medieval sexuality as something shrouded entirely in darkness, both literal and figurative, with couples fumbling awkwardly through consummation, while priests stood outside bedroom doors, ready to condemn any enjoyment of the marital act. But was medieval sex really as joyless, repressed, and mechanical as we've been led to believe? The answer, as with most things historical, is far more complex, contradictory, and surprisingly human than the stereotypes suggest. Beyond the theology and social regulations, what was the physical experience of sex actually like for medieval couples? The practicalities of daily life shaped intimate encounters in ways that might surprise modern readers. Privacy, as we understand it today, was a luxury few medieval people enjoyed. Peasant families typically lived in one- or two-room dwellings, often sharing sleeping spaces with children, elderly relatives, and sometimes even livestock during cold winters. The concept of a private bedroom reserved exclusively for the married couple was largely unknown outside the upper classes. This meant that couples had to be creative about finding moments and spaces for intimacy. Summer months offered more opportunities, as couples might slip away to fields, barns, or forests for privacy. The relative darkness of medieval nights, without street lighting or the ambient glow of modern life, also provided cover for nighttime activities. However, the need for discretion and the lack of privacy meant that sexual encounters were often hurried, quiet affairs rather than leisurely explorations. The physical conditions of medieval life also shaped sexual experiences. Most people bathed infrequently by modern standards, though this varied by region and social class. Public bathhouses existed in many medieval towns, and some people did bathe regularly, but the stereotype of the perpetually filthy medieval peasant, while exaggerated, contains a grain of truth. Body odor, bad breath, and various skin conditions were common realities that couples simply had to accept. Clothing presented its own challenges. Medieval garments, especially for women, could be complex and time-consuming to remove and replace. This encouraged practical approaches to undressing, or not fully undressing at all. Many couples likely engaged in sex while still partially clothed, particularly during colder months when removing all clothing would have been uncomfortably cold in unheated bedrooms. Beds themselves varied enormously by social class. Wealthy households might have substantial wooden bed frames with feather mattresses, fine linens, and bed curtains that provided a measure of privacy even in shared rooms. Poor families might sleep on straw pallets on the floor, with rough blankets for warmth. The quality of one's sleeping arrangements directly affected the comfort and pleasure of sexual activity. Lighting conditions during intimate moments were generally dim. Candles and oil lamps were expensive, so most sexual activity occurred in darkness or by the faint glow of a dying fire. This darkness might have reduced inhibitions for some couples, while increasing anxiety for others, particularly inexperienced brides on their wedding nights. The connection between sex and reproduction was understood, though the exact mechanisms remained mysterious. For most medieval couples, sexual activity regularly led to pregnancy, and pregnancy was both hoped for and feared. Children were economic assets in agricultural societies, providing labor and support in old age. The Church taught that procreation was the primary purpose of marriage, and producing heirs was essential for maintaining family lines and property. Yet pregnancy and childbirth were also dangerous, and many women did not survive the experience. Maternal mortality rates were high by modern standards, perhaps 1 to 2% per birth, which meant that over the course of multiple pregnancies, a woman's cumulative risk was substantial. This created a complicated emotional landscape around conception. Couples might eagerly hope for children, while simultaneously fearing the dangers pregnancy posed. Women who had already borne several children and survived might be more anxious about additional pregnancies than first-time mothers who didn't yet understand the risks. The medieval understanding of conception included various folk beliefs alongside more systematic medical theories. Some believed that certain sexual positions or timing could influence the sex of the child. Others thought that the intensity of pleasure during conception affected the child's characteristics. Women might be advised to think virtuous thoughts during sex to ensure the baby's good character. Once pregnant, women were subject to numerous restrictions and recommendations, many rooted more in superstition than medical knowledge. They might be told to avoid certain foods, not to look at disturbing sights, or to maintain calm emotions to avoid marking the baby. Childbirth itself was exclusively a female domain. When a woman's labour began, Midwives and female relatives gathered to assist, while men were excluded. The birthing chamber became a temporary women's space where knowledge, experiences, and traditional practices were shared. Some of these practices were helpful, such as allowing women to move around during labour rather than lying flat, while others, like refusing to wash hands between deliveries, contributed to infection and death. The postpartum period, or lying in, typically lasted several weeks. During this time, the new mother remained mostly in bed, cared for by other women, while her body recovered from childbirth. She was considered ritually impure and could not attend church until she had been churched, a ceremony that marked her purification and return to normal social and religious life. For the couple's sexual relationship, childbirth created an extended interruption. The combination of the church's prohibition on sex during pregnancy and the lying-in period meant that each baby resulted in months without intercourse. For women who spent much of their adult lives either pregnant or recovering from childbirth, this significantly shaped their sexual experiences. Despite the church's insistence that procreation was the purpose of sex, many medieval couples sought to limit or space their pregnancies. The methods available to them were limited, often ineffective, and officially condemned, but evidence suggests they were nonetheless employed. Coitus interruptus, or withdrawal, was probably the most common method of attempting to prevent pregnancy. The Church condemned it as sinful, comparing it to the biblical sin of Onan, but it required no special knowledge or materials and left no evidence. How effectively and consistently couples used this method is impossible to know, but theological condemnations suggest it was common enough to concern the clergy. Various herbal preparations were believed to prevent conception or induce menstruation, a euphemistic way of describing early abortion. Plants like pennyroyal, tansy, rue, and savin were mentioned in medical texts and folk traditions as having contraceptive or abortifacient properties. Modern analysis suggests that some of these plants do have mild effects on fertility or can stimulate uterine contractions, though they are also toxic and dangerous in the doses that would be required to be effective. Women with knowledge of these herbs walked a dangerous line. Using them too openly could bring accusations of witchcraft or murder, particularly if a pregnancy ended under suspicious circumstances. Yet there's evidence that such knowledge was transmitted between women, from mothers to daughters, from midwives to patients, through networks of female knowledge that operated alongside and sometimes in defiance of official male medicine. Barrier methods of contraception also existed, though they were rarely discussed in texts. Some sources mention pessaries, objects inserted into the vagina to block conception. These might have been made of wool soaked in various substances or of other materials. Their effectiveness was likely minimal, but the mere existence of such methods shows that medieval women were not passive in relation to their fertility. When contraception failed, some women resorted to abortion. This was both sinful and, in many jurisdictions, criminal, but it nonetheless occurred. The line between attempting to restore menstruation and deliberately ending a pregnancy was often blurred in medieval discussions, perhaps intentionally so. Before quickening, the point at which fetal movement could be felt, usually around 18 to 20 weeks, abortion was sometimes treated less seriously than later termination. Infanticide was perhaps the darkest response to unwanted pregnancy. Illegitimate children, children born to families already struggling to feed existing offspring, or infants with obvious disabilities, might be accidentally smothered, abandoned, or otherwise disposed of. Legal records contain cases of suspected infanticide, though proving such cases was difficult when infant mortality from natural causes was already so high. The distinction between neglect and murder, between accident and intention, was often impossible to establish. Medieval people who survived childhood had a reasonable chance of reaching old age, though old meant something different than it does today. A person in their 50s was considered elderly, and those who reached their 60s or beyond were remarkable. How did aging affect sexuality and sexual relationships? The sources are frustratingly silent on this question for the most part, but we can make some inferences. Medical texts occasionally discussed the decline of sexual capacity with age, noting that older men produced less semen and experienced less desire, while older women were no longer capable of conception. For women, menopause marked a significant transition. No longer capable of pregnancy, postmenopausal women occupied an ambiguous position in medieval society. On one hand, they were freed from the dangers of childbirth. On the other, they lost the function that officially justified marital sex. Some medical texts suggested that older women became more masculine in temperament and appearance, growing facial hair and becoming more assertive. Whether couples continued sexual activity after the woman's childbearing years ended is unclear. The Church's emphasis on procreation might suggest that sex should cease, but the principle of the marital debt implied that spouses still had obligations to one another. Older couples who had been together for decades likely developed their own private accommodations about intimate matters. Widowhood was common, given the hazards of life and childbirth. Women often outlived their husbands, while men who lost their wives frequently remarried, sometimes multiple times. The sexuality of widows was a subject of particular concern in medieval society. Young widows especially were viewed with suspicion. They had sexual experience but no husband, making them dangerous to social order. They were expected to remain chaste, but were also suspected of lechery. Older widows who had passed beyond childbearing age enjoyed more freedom than almost any other category of medieval women. No longer subject to a husband's authority and too old to be sexually threatening, they could own property, run businesses, and live independently. Some became respected members of their communities, while others were marginalized or even accused of witchcraft, particularly if they were poor and socially isolated. How did medieval people learn about sex? In our era of sex education classes and widely available information, it's difficult to imagine approaching sexual maturity with the limited and often inaccurate knowledge available to medieval youth. For boys, sexual knowledge came from various sources. Older boys and men might share information, though much of it was likely crude and incorrect. Young men in monasteries, universities, or apprenticeships lived in homosocial environments where sexual matters were discussed, albeit often in ways the authorities would have disapproved of. Pornographic or erotic texts did exist, though their circulation was limited, and most boys would have been illiterate anyway. Farm boys growing up in rural areas would have witnessed animal mating and may have understood the basic mechanics of sex from observation. However, the application of this knowledge to human sexuality was not necessarily straightforward, particularly given the Church's teaching that human sexuality should be different from that of beasts. For girls, sexual education was even more limited and controlled. Young women were supposed to remain innocent and ignorant until marriage, at which point they would presumably learn through experience. Some mothers or older female relatives might provide basic information, but often in euphemistic terms that left girls confused and frightened about what to expect on their wedding nights. Medical knowledge, such as it was, remained largely inaccessible to common people, while texts like those by Galen or medieval medical encyclopedias contained information about reproduction and sexuality. These were written in Latin and owned only by the educated elite. Even when vernacular translations began to appear in the later Middle Ages, literacy rates were low and books were expensive. Midwives possessed practical knowledge about female anatomy, childbirth, and related matters, and they passed this knowledge along to apprentices and sometimes to their patients. However, midwifery was a practical art rather than a theoretical science, and even midwives operated with limited understanding of internal anatomy and physiology. The result was that most medieval people approached sexual activity with a mixture of folk knowledge, religious teaching, practical observation, and simple trial and error. Misunderstandings and anxieties must have been common, particularly for young people experiencing their first sexual encounters. Medieval sexuality engaged all the senses in ways shaped by the material conditions of medieval life. Understanding these sensory dimensions helps us appreciate the texture of medieval intimate experience. Touch was obviously central to sexual activity, but medieval touch occurred in a context very different from our own. Skin conditions, scars, calluses from manual labor, and the general roughness of life meant that bodies felt different. For peasants whose hands were hardened by agricultural work, even a gentle caress would have had a different quality than it does for people with soft, moisturized skin. Fabrics and textures also shaped tactile experience. The wealthy enjoyed silk, fine wool, and smooth linen against their skin, while the poor made do with rougher materials. The sensory contrast between clothing and bare skin would have been more pronounced than in our age of soft cotton and synthetic fabrics. Scent played a complicated role. Without modern hygiene products, human bodies had stronger, more varied odours. These were not necessarily unpleasant to medieval people who had different standards and expectations. In fact, some medical texts discussed the importance of scent in sexual attraction, and the concept of personal odour as a component of sexual appeal existed. The wealthy used perfumes, scented waters, and herbs to modify their natural scents, though these medieval fragrances bore little resemblance to modern perfumes. Rosewater, lavender, and various spices might be employed, creating a scent landscape quite different from today. For common people, the smells of smoke, animals, earth, and honest sweat would have been the norm. Taste entered into sexuality through kissing, which was recognized as an important part of intimate relations. Medieval medical texts sometimes discussed kissing in the context of foreplay, acknowledging that it stimulated desire. The taste of another person, influenced by diet, dental health, and overall hygiene, would have been quite different from modern kissing. Visual elements of sexuality were constrained by the general darkness of medieval nights and the modest covering of bodies by day. The reveal of nudity, or even partially exposed skin, would have had powerful erotic significance precisely because bodies were usually covered. This created a different erotic economy than exists in modern societies, where semi-nudity is commonplace in media and public spaces. Sound also contributed to the experience. The whispers of lovers, the creaking of beds, the rustle of fabric. But couples had to be mindful of being overheard, particularly in crowded households. The need for quiet might have dampened some aspects of sexual expression, while heightening others, like the anticipation of stolen moments of privacy. The relationship between sexuality and spirituality in the Middle Ages was complex and sometimes contradictory. While the Church officially viewed sex as inferior to celibacy and primarily justified it for procreation, there were also threads of thought that acknowledged sexuality as part of God's creation. Some theologians argued that marital sex, properly conducted, was not merely free from sin, but could actually be meritorious, a way of serving God by fulfilling one's marital duties and creating new Christians. This more positive view never entirely displaced the Augustinian suspicion of sexual pleasure, but it did offer couples a framework for understanding their intimate lives as compatible with Christian virtue. Marriage itself was eventually elevated to a sacrament, though this happened relatively late in the medieval period. This theological development implied that the marital relationship, including its sexual dimension, had sacred significance. The union of husband and wife was sometimes compared to the union of Christ and the Church, lending a mystical dimension to even the most physical aspects of marriage. At the same time, mystical and ascetic traditions emphasized the superiority of virginity and celibacy. Saints' lives and devotional literature frequently praised those who renounced sexuality, sometimes in graphic terms that revealed a preoccupation with precisely what was being rejected. This created a tension in medieval culture between the spiritual ideal of sexual renunciation and the practical reality that most people would marry and engage in sexual activity. Some medieval mystics described their religious experiences in unmistakably erotic language. The visions of mystics like Hildegard of Bingen, or later figures like Teresa of Avila, used metaphors of union, penetration, and ecstasy that blurred the lines between spiritual and sexual experience. Whether these descriptions reflect actual sublimated sexual feelings or simply use the language of sexual intimacy to describe ineffable spiritual states is a matter of debate. The cult of the Virgin Mary offered another lens through which medieval people thought about sexuality and gender. Mary's perpetual virginity, combined with her motherhood, presented an impossible ideal for ordinary women, yet she was held up as the perfect model of femininity. This Marian devotion both elevated and constrained medieval women, offering them a powerful spiritual identification, while also insisting on standards of purity that few could meet. For men, the ideal of knightly chastity, particularly as developed in Romance literature and in military religious orders like the Templars, created a model of masculinity that incorporated sexual restraint. The knight was supposed to master his passions, including sexual desire, as part of his broader self-discipline and virtue. How often real knights lived up to this ideal is another question entirely. As we reach the end of this exploration, what can we conclude about medieval sexuality, and what lessons might it hold for us? First, the medieval period demonstrates that human sexuality is always culturally constructed, shaped by the particular beliefs, institutions, and material conditions of its time. Medieval people thought about sex differently than we do. Their categories, concerns, and assumptions were their own. Yet beneath these cultural differences, we can recognize familiar human experiences: desire, pleasure, anxiety, love, and the eternal negotiation between individual wants and social expectations. Second, the gap between official norms and actual behavior is not unique to our time. Medieval people received clear messages from the church about how they should conduct their sexual lives, yet the evidence suggests that many ignored or modified these teachings to fit their own circumstances. Laws, rules, and moral proclamations tell us what authorities wanted people to do, but not necessarily what people actually did. Third, the medieval period reminds us that systems of sexual regulation are always about more than sex itself. They are about property, social order, power, and control. Who could have sex with whom, under what circumstances, and with what consequences, was intimately bound up with questions of class, gender, legitimacy, and social hierarchy. Fourth, we should be cautious about judgments of sexual repression or liberation that are too simple. Medieval sexuality was constrained in some ways that would be unacceptable to us now, particularly regarding consent, women's autonomy, and the punishment of non-normative behavior. Yet medieval people also had their own forms of sexual agency, knowledge, and pleasure that we might miss if we view them only through the lens of church doctrine or our own modern assumptions. Finally, studying medieval sexuality reveals both how much has changed and how much remains the same. We have better medical knowledge, more effective contraception, and, in many places, greater legal equality and recognition of sexual diversity. Yet people still negotiate between desire and duty, still struggle with questions of fidelity and passion, still seek intimacy and connection in a world that sometimes seems designed to frustrate those needs. The medieval period was neither a dark age of complete sexual repression nor a lost age of innocence. It was, like our own time, a complex era in which people lived, loved, desired, and connected as best they could within the constraints and possibilities available to them. In recognizing their humanity and the particularity of their circumstances, we might gain not only historical insight, but also perspective on our own sexual culture and the ways it, too, will someday seem as distant and strange as the medieval world now appears to us.